running a $1 trillion budget deficit, by identity, we're creating $1 trillion of bank reserves. In normal times, banks don't want to hold excess reserves, so they offer them in the overnight market called the Fed funds market in the United States. That drives the overnight interest rate down, okay, potentially to zero. And so what the Fed does is it sells bonds to drain excess reserves. So bond sales are actually part of monetary policy, and it really doesn't matter whether it's the Fed that sells them or the Treasury that sells them. The purpose of selling bonds is to drain excess reserves from the banking system so that the central bank can hit its overnight interest rate target. Otherwise, the interest rate would be driven to zero. Okay, we're in unusual times right now where the Fed wants the interest rate to be about zero. So it can leave excess reserves in the banking system, but this is not normal. So really, bond sales have nothing to do with borrowing. They're not part of the fiscal operations of the state. They're part of the monetary policy operations to hit the interest rate target. And just in parentheses, a budget surplus is the opposite. You're always draining the reserves out of the system. You got to put them back in. You do that through open market purchases. Central bank policy. We've had a long history of debate about what the central bank should do. Should it have a money target? Should it have an inflation target? Should it have interest rate targets? Okay, economists have finally reached a consensus. Okay, one that we discovered a long time ago, which is that central banks always operate with an overnight interest rate target. No matter what they tell you, that's what they're actually doing, an overnight interest rate target. And that means that they have to accommodate exactly the demand for reserves or they'll miss their target. And that is why they use the bond sales or bond purchases in order to make sure banks have the right amount of currency reserves. What this means is that the interest rate is set by the central bank and they hit their interest rate target through the open market operations. Okay? Now, they set it anywhere they want. If we want zero interest rates, we can have zero interest rates. It doesn't matter whether the budget deficit is $1 trillion or we have a budget surplus. We can hit our interest rate target. This is not true for a country that is not sovereign in the currency sense that I'm using that term. So, for example, Greece cannot set its interest rate. Okay, it is subject to the bond vigilantes. The United States is not, and neither is Japan. And note, Japan has budget deficits even bigger than ours, and they've been doing it for more than 20 years and has zero interest rates all along, because they want them to be zero. So far, everything I've told you is a description of reality. There's no policy recommendation, there's no theory involved in this. I didn't say anything about what the government ought to do, I'm describing what the government actually does. Okay, we can move on to policy that could follow from this. And here I'll rely on Abba Lerner, what he called the principles of functional finance. Here we're talking about should, not what the government actually does. The government should spend more if there's unemployment. If you have unemployment, it means government spending is too low. You need to spend more. If the unemployment rate is 8%, forget the budget deficit, it's not important. We cannot go insolvent, we can never miss a payment. We have to solve the unemployment problem. Okay? So government should spend more. Government can also reduce taxes. It's usually less effective, but that's also a policy option. The government should supply more money. What he meant was bank reserves if interest rates are too high. Okay? Of course, that's not a problem right now. We're supplying plenty of reserves and the banks have plenty of excess. And he insisted that the budgetary outcome and the government debt outcome should never be a primary consideration. What matters is unemployment, inflation, and where the interest rates are relative to where you want them to be. Now, governments are not financially constrained, but they do impose, self-impose constraints on themselves. Okay? These may be a good idea, they may be a bad idea. The point is they are self-imposed. We have a variety of self-imposed constraints. We have a budgeting process. That is a self-imposed constraint, and it's probably a good idea to have a budgeting process. Okay? We have debt limits in the United States. We're kind of unusual. We tell the federal government, go ahead and spend this amount per year, but if you get up to the debt limit, you can't spend. This is probably not a very good self-imposed constraint, but we imposed it on ourselves. We can remove it anytime we want, and normally we remove it every time we reach it. Okay? This next time around, maybe we won't. Okay? But it's self-imposed. Markets don't impose it. Okay? It doesn't come from any law of nature. We imposed it. And we also have operational constraints. And so people will say, well, hold it, what you told us before isn't quite right, because the Treasury has to write checks on its account at the central bank, the Fed. Okay, this is true. The Treasury has to have money in its account at the central bank. But we found ways to make sure it always has the money in its account, because otherwise it would be bouncing checks to Social Security recipients, for example. So we never have the Treasury running out of money in its account. And I can talk about that if you want. And when Stephanie Kelton comes, she's the best on this topic. We also have the central bank is prohibited from buying Treasury debt new issues. So the central bank can't buy bonds directly from the Treasury, because that would allow the Treasury to very easily always have money in its account. Okay? But again, we get around this very easily. The Treasury just sells them to banks, and then the Treasury's account at private banks is moved to the Fed. Okay? And then the Fed buys the bonds from the banks. So they get around it easily, but the point is it's self-imposed. They use special depositories and special tax and loan accounts. Summary. Am I doing all right? Okay. Deficit spending creates private financial wealth, net credits. Note that central banking operations do not. We've got the Fed doing its best, I suppose, to stimulate the economy, but the problem is it can't provide any net credits. It can buy assets from you, but it can't spend money into existence. It has to lend money into existence or substitute assets you've already got for a credit at the Fed. This doesn't stimulate much. This is why quantitative easing hasn't done anything, and it won't. All it can do is drive interest rates to zero, that's it. The Treasury spends money into existence. It's much more effective. It doesn't matter whether bonds have to be sold first, which is one of the self-imposed constraints, so long as the central bank accommodates reserve demand. There is no limit on the Treasury due to this self-imposed constraint. It doesn't matter whether the central bank is prohibited from buying new issues. It goes round about that through the banks. And it doesn't matter whether Treasury must have money in its account at the central bank to spend. The central bank and banks cooperate to make sure it always has the money in its account. Euro, one slide. This is an example of a non-sovereign currency from the point of view of the individual member states. They gave up their own sovereign currencies, the lira, when they joined the Union. They adopted what is essentially a foreign currency for each one of these states. They became very much like USA states, and this is what we argued from before the time that the EMU began. We said they're going to be subject to the market in the same way that Mississippi is subject to the market. The only surprise is that markets ignored that fact for as long as they did. They are constrained in their spending by tax revenue, bond sales, and ultimately by the willingness of the ECB to lend to them and to buy government debt. And we're finding that the ECB is very gradually and begrudgingly doing this. Okay? But there's a great uncertainty over how far this will go, and that's why Euroland is in such a mess. The problem is, although the ECB has been behaving in a way similar to what the Fed is doing, they have nothing like Washington, Uncle Sam, to provide spending euros into existence. So the ECB can lend them, but they have no equivalent to Washington to spend them into existence to solve their problem. Conclusions. Currency issuing government spends by crediting bank accounts, taxes by debiting those. It can always afford to spend more. There still are issues such as inflation, exchange rate effects, and interest rate effects. Okay? But there's no affordability problem. When the president tells you he's run out of money, that is just not true. Sovereign currency gives more policy space. There's no default risk. The government can control its interest rates, and it can use policy to achieve full employment. Now, I need to be careful because people hear things I didn't say. So let me go through a few things I did not say. I did say sovereign government faces no financial constraints. It cannot become insolvent in its own non-convertible. That just means we don't promise to exchange it for gold or for foreign currencies at a fixed exchange rate. But it can only buy what is for sale. It can't buy things that aren't for sale for its own currency. For the United States, this is not a problem. Everything for sale in the United States is for sale in dollars, but that's not always true. Even in some countries that have sovereign currencies, there are things not for sale in their own sovereign currency, so that can be a problem. I did not say the government ought to buy everything for sale. Okay? The size of the government is a political decision with economic effects. Is our government too big? That's a political question. Okay. Could we afford a bigger government? Of course we could. Should we have a bigger government? Political question. Okay? With economic effects. I did not say that deficits cannot be inflationary. If government spending is too high, you can get inflation. Okay? I did not say that deficits can't affect exchange rates. If our government spent more, ran us up to full employment, it's possible the dollar could devalue. I'll tell you, the empirical evidence for that is extremely poor. There is no direct link between the size of government spending and the size of budget deficits and the value of a currency. Okay? Alan Greenspan said, we have no economic model that is able to explain exchange rate movements. And the reason is because speculation plays such a big role. And finally, if a sovereign government lets its currency float, that gives it more policy space. I won't go through that now, but people who studied economics know what I mean. And floating means a currency can go up and down. So yes, it's possible that fiscal policy and monetary policy that are adopted to achieve full employment, for example, could have impacts on the exchange rate. Thanks. You can read more at the blogs or at the Levy Institute or email me. And I hope that this will be up online. Thanks.